Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
We were sleeping. I've been sleeping. I've been turning away from a truth I wanted not to face. There is a wound that won't heal at the center of the galaxy. There is a darkness reaching like rust into everything around us. We let it grow, and now it's here.
How many men have you killed, Willow?
I don't know.
50? 100? Countless.
Countless has a nice ring to it.
And how many lives have you saved?
500,000. Population of King's Landing. Tell me if your precious Randy commanded you to kill your own father and stand by while thousands of men, women, children burned alive, would you have done it? Would you have kept your oath then?
Our time has come. We prepared. We grew stronger. While you rested in your cradle of power, you were trusted to lead the Republic. But you were deceived. You assumed no force could challenge you. And now, finally, we have returned.
The visions are clear now. I see possible futures all at once. Our enemies are all around us. And in so many futures they prevail. But I do see a way. There is a narrow way through.
It's not a prophecy. It's a story that you keep telling, but it's not their story, it's yours. They deserve to be led by one of their own. What your people did to this world is heartbreaking.
We gave them something to hope for.
That's not hope!
We have survived by hiding from them, by running from them. But they are the gatekeepers. They are guarding all the doors, they are holding all the keys, which means that sooner or later, someone is going to have to fight them.
I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us.
Forgive me. I did not see. I have failed you all.
You fool brain. Captain Armor, I do not know what strength is like that. But I swear to you, I will not let the White City fall. Our people fail. Our people. Our people.
I wish you good fortune in the wars to come. And now it begins.
No. Now it ends.
All right, people, welcome back to the narrative. Sounds like my voice is back for at least the first 10 minutes or so of this show. I got sick right before going to Vegas, and then I went to Vegas, and, you know, the rest is history. That's just what happens. So we'll see how long the voice lasts tonight. Welcome back to the show, episode 14. That's a pretty sweet number. I like that one. Couple of sevens in there. Chat's already got me riled up. Talking about abandoning Massachusetts. I've got massholes who have left, abandoning the fight. I've got Bay Theater Dave, who I hung out with in Vegas, who called me a gatekeeper of Badlands, and he meant it as a compliment, except in the combat sports world, the word gatekeeper has a very negative connotation. So just totally unprofessional. Chat's already got me riled up. But we're going to have a good show. We're going to endeavor to make this a good one. Before we get into this show, a couple bits of housekeeping. Number one, we're going to talk about our first sponsor tonight. We've got our main sponsor is Save Pulse. Going to save them for a little bit later. Let you guys get piling in here from Eye of the Storm. Some good comms lately. I saw Stormy posting about the boom stuff. I'm sure he was talking about that tonight. Stormy and Abs. But before we get to that, our first sponsor tonight is River. River BTC. River has announced Bitcoin interest on cash. US dollars in your River account will earn a high yield interest rate that can be paid in Bitcoin. With the price of groceries, mortgage, and tuition on a steep rise, people are now looking at a retirement age of 80 instead of 60. It's all because dollars are losing value at a record pace. The challenge is finding a way to hold on to your dollar while still getting ahead. That's where River Bitcoin comes in. River Bitcoin's interest on cash protects your dollars with FDIC insurance while offering you the option to reap the potential gains of Bitcoin. Over the past 2 years, you would have earned 2 times the rate of most high-yield savings accounts and 16 times the rate of a national average savings account with Bitcoin interest on cash. Get started at badlandsmedia.tv/river. Move your cash over to River today. badlandsmedia.tv/river. All right, I just switched my headphones, and now I sound very strange to myself. So thank you to River for sponsoring the show. One other bit of housekeeping. Just got back from GART. Didn't know if I was going to be there. Made it happen last minute, largely thanks to Mrs. Bright. But here's the real shit. This weekend, 2 months from now, 6 weeks from now, GART Plymouth kicks off. First weekend of May, and I don't know how many Massachusetts people watch the show or how many New Englanders do, but enough of you have made noise about doing a GART in New England that we decided to do it. We're making it happen. And if you motherfuckers don't show up, it's not going to be my head. That's all I'm telling you. So we got the lineup right there. We got John, we got Chris, we got me, we got Zach, we got Ghost. The memes will be flowing, I'm sure, May 1st to 4th in Plymouth. The prices are lower on this one. We've been trying to make that happen. Depends on the venue, depends on where we are. But, there's limited capacity at this one. Have no idea whether or not we're going to sell out. Go to badlandsmedia.tv/events. Grab your tickets. Don't be a disappointment to everybody in your life. All right. Now, before we get into the show, this could be a weird one. It could be a great one. We're going to have to see. I have never spoken to the man who is going to be joining me tonight, which is actually in the morning for him, where he is in the world. We've both been at Badlands for quite a while, and yet he just seems to keep slipping out of my grasp. He does a show with Ghost. He's kind of always like near Badlands, but not fully committed. He's got some disturbing tendencies, some disturbing sort of history to him that we're going to try to unpack tonight. So I am looking forward. This is as much about me trying to figure this guy out as it is about you guys, although a bunch of you probably watch his show. So, and one more way to set this up. Speaking of GART Plymouth, I saw somebody in the chat earlier talking about like, oh, I'm a masshole, but I abandoned Massachusetts. And I keep saying, I'm going to die trying to reforge this state. And if one thing gives me hope about restoring Massachusetts to its former glory, it is the fact that there is one state in the Union that is more hopeless than Massachusetts. And that state is the birthplace of my guest tonight. That is the 51st state of the United States, the state of Canada. And my guest tonight is Matt Ehret. How you doing, Matt?
Good, Burdick. How you doing? That was a fun intro, man. It was a very fun intro.
Yeah, I just, I don't know how well you know me, even from afar, but I like to start shit right away. That's how most of my relationships begin, including my marriage.
Well, it's fun, right? That we've been corresponding over Telegram and chatting, but never actually had a real pseudo flesh to pseudo flesh conversation. We had this medium of the digital mode between us, but still, I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, man. All right. So for anybody who doesn't know, I do not promote this enough, but the Badlands has a Substack, badlands.substack.com. I edit over there. Matt is one of our best writers. he's been writing a bunch of series. One of the recent ones is Real Patriots Don't Think Like Hitler. I love that one because besides the fact that you bring a lot of historical perspective to this stuff that a lot of us don't know, this show's all about narrative. I don't know if you've seen it before, but my whole shtick, I think of everything in terms of story structure. I used to be a fiction writer. That kind of brought me in a roundabout way into trying to figure out why our whole culture is being destroyed. And I see politics as storytelling. I'm sure you can relate with history. Sort of history is written by the winners, which I want to get into that in this episode. But the reason I like that series you've been working on the Substack is we're always looking in this truth community, info war, whatever you want to call it, for sort of threats. And I feel like the most obvious threats is the easy stuff, right? It's like communism, super far left politicians, that kind of stuff. The more subversive threats are I call them the wolves in the house, the wolves that are already in the walls, the ones that are trying to look like you and sound like you and talk like you, but that are not you. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but to me, that's what I take out of that Hitler series. There's that element of MAGA that likes to say, hey, maybe we were lied to about literally everything, and maybe go down some pathways that are not the paths they think they are.
Yeah, I think that would be fun to do, and that's my concern as well. I know that the human mind tends to be often it tricks itself into jumping into extremes. So, we could be on a wrong path on one idea, and we could discover that we've been lied to about this thing. I used to be a leftist, for example. I read Noam Chomsky. That's where I sort of situated my identity. Then I started discovering that, okay, there's something toxic in this whole leftist culture, and I'm Canadian. You can't blame me. It's part of, you can't avoid it.
We can't blame you, but I understand.
Thank you for understanding. And then you started scratching the surface, and you're like, oh, wait a minute. Some of these icons, these high priests controlling the narrative that is grooming and incubating this left culture actually are promoting mass population control, which Chomsky was, or global government, which Chomsky was. And then later on with COVID, mass forced vaccinations, which he did. And you're like, well, there's something wrong. There's true things that are attractive as honey. And I say this in a weird way, because I mean, the types of things that attract people into the left world tend to be an acknowledgement of mass evil and destruction of Africa, the Middle East, done by very bad forces.
Right.
Yeah, and it's true. Like they're acknowledging a spectrum of reality that otherwise people who are too happy with the status quo don't want to look at, which is like the evil that happened when we went into Vietnam and killed God knows how many hundreds of thousands or millions of East Asian civilians, things like that. But then you're like, okay, and then what I've noticed is that people will then go to the opposite extreme after discovering that they were misled. Then they will go hard, so far right that they become defenders, like neocon-like defenders of the status quo. And you're like, that's not good either. So there's often something being missed. And I think the high-level game masters at the top, they know this attribute of the human condition, and they play it. And they play us against ourselves again and again and again for thousands of years. So yeah, I'm trying to, with this series, sort of situate a little bit of that, help inoculate people, I guess it's a bad word, but from falling into those traps, so that they appreciate how Hitler also emerged as a movement out of something which doesn't look that different from some of the cultural dynamics and conspiracy theory analysis at play today. Because he was talking about Freemasonic bankers, conspiracies, Jewish bankers, and all of these things that sound very similar to the sort of thing that we encounter in our field of alternative media analysis. It's not that different. But the solution was something that was being funded by the City of London bankers, the same Wall Street bankers that he thought he hated. He was actually getting his massive money, support, a lot of other things too, which I go through in that series, from that same power structure.
Yeah, it's well said. And I use the term threat assessment a lot. Besides being a writer, I used to be a full contact fighter, and it's like, what are you doing in fighting? You're threat assessing, right? You're like constantly what is what's this guy trying to do? What's he trying to set me up for? And I feel like in 2025, it's so funny because most of us feel more positive now. I mean, to be conservative about it, more positive now than we felt 8 months ago, right? Like things seem to be in a better place. Ironically, I said this in Vegas at GART. Some of us are taking a little bit of heat, John and Chris probably most of all, but for maybe seeming the term doomer gets thrown around a lot in this community. And it's funny because I'm considered by many people who follow me to be very positive, maybe sometimes too positive, almost unrealistically so, some people would say, which we can talk about some of that later. Some of my more harebrained theories that I want your historical perspective on. But the reason I bring that up is I think people are feeling good, people in the MAGA base, people that got rung through that Biden administration era, whatever you think about it, however you think it started or not, legitimate or not. And people are ready to take the wins, right? Like whether you're a Trump maximalist, a MAGA person, an independent who swung that way, a Q person, the Q drops, etc. People are very reticent to listen to what they consider dooming, which I would consider threat assessment. And to your point about, Hitler is a historical example. But when we look right now, I would say, okay, when would a movement, an ideology, etc., be most vulnerable to subversion? And I would argue it's actually not when they're at their low point emotionally, because I would think when you're at your low point, when you're kind of being attacked from all sides, when the city gates are besieged, you're on your guard, right? Like everything is a threat. Things aren't going great. You're trying to sort of contract and condense inward. But when you're feeling good and when everything's positive all the time, I think that's when you really have to look out for threats, which is why some of us are trying to say, hey, we're not talking about full Hitler stuff. I'm not seeing a lot of that in the MAGA world. But, we do see some people that maybe in the mainstream adjacent media are trying to rebrand themselves and, hey, I know I was telling you to wear a mask and take the vax, but we're all friends now, right? And I know I told you to vote for DeSantis and then this guy and then this guy and then this guy, and all of whom are funded by people who are not necessarily behind the people that you like, but we can just move on from that, right? And I know I was never banned from YouTube or Twitter or anything, and you guys all were, but we're all on the same side now. So I wonder what you see about the modern sort of the modern battle space and some of those more subversive threats compared to the obvious kind of leftist communist threats.
Yeah, well, and both kind of converge and come from a similar source, I find, as far as trying to get rid of global, the idea of getting rid of the principles that were fought for in the American Revolution and restoring some form of feudal controls by an oligarchical, unelected elite of high bloodlines over the masses is not a new idea, and it comes in various forms. Whether the 21st century or the 20th century fascism, whether the type of concoction that Marx and Engels, especially Engels, who I see as kind of the handler of Marx, or even worse, Bakunin, the pushing the anarcho communist variety of the same thing. Ultimately, it all kind of converges on the same place. Fabian socialism, you name it, and you've got different flavors that are ultimately got the same toxicity at the soul of it. People think that they have a choice of poison, but it's all poison. And what you've said about complacency it's very important, because I was reading a statistic that was getting across driving accidents and how most of them happen when people are like a minute from their home. That's right. Like, they may not be fatal, but that's when you get, and same thing for like tightrope walkers too. It's usually that last couple of steps that the falls happen. It's not in the middle of the tightrope. It's the last couple of steps, because your guard is down. You're celebrating prematurely, and at that point, that's where the missteps happen. So it's the same sort of vibe that you just communicated there. Right. That's when we have to be even more diligent and on our guard, because we do have very sophisticated, dishonest actors that operate throughout intelligence agencies that are very good at weaving narratives that are psychologically sensitive to the zeitgeist. The oligarchy has a sort of secret science, as some might call it, a secret science of making us stupid or unself-reflective in order to get us to become our own worst enemies. Which is why, again, I like the concept for your show and what you've been doing. I've seen a couple of episodes, and I think the best creative fighters against the empire have tended to move through the domain of creative writing. And I mean, Shakespeare is a great example of somebody who made the point, all the world's a stage and we are all actors.
Right.
And throughout his various theatrical plays, he's infusing hugely important lessons pertaining to the nature of humanity. Like, how can you not fall for an Iago that's whispering, this trusted Iago, honest Iago, who's just always there whispering sweet little flatteries, but yet also warnings into the ear of his trusted, the people who he's advising, like Othello, or Othello's best friend. And he's getting everybody, he's profiled these different otherwise virtuous characters on the stage who are good people, but they've got flaws of they lack self-reflection. And because of that, this Venetian spy figure, Iago, who's like ingratiated himself, is able to inflame their jealousies, their passions in a very bad way, to the point that Othello ends up murdering his beloved wife Desdemona, doesn't even want to do it because he's become convinced that Desdemona is having sex with his best friend and he's insecure. Anyway, it's a great lesson for the audience of like, how do you not fall for this sort of thing? And all of Shakespeare's plays kind of do that, which I really appreciate. Where Jonathan Swift, and his Gulliver's Travels, same sort of thing. There's all sorts of lessons about how to not be a dupe for the empire and how to be your own person. Right. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I had the thought recently. I think I might have referenced it in one of my articles. But speaking of Shakespeare, I had sort of started thinking of Badlands and what we do as the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern of the battle space, where there's sort of this weird. I always use the term bicameral, and I use it in a bit of a different way than it's usually used in psychology, but just essentially the idea kind of splitting your mind along multiple rails and being able to keep those threads, even if those two threads that you're observing reality with don't necessarily jive with each other. You've got to be able to keep them running, right? Because if you kind of get, and you probably think about this a lot from a historical perspective, history is a story, right? Now, when I say something such and such is a story, the connotation of the word story, maybe this is unique to the West, but is fiction. That's what most people think, fiction, when you say story. In other words, they think untrue when you say the word story. And that's never what I mean by it. Now, obviously, fiction is stories, right? Stories can be untrue, but true stories are stories as well. And I often, the tagline of this show is "The war is a story, the story is a war." And, to your point about Shakespeare, I think it's the stories. The reason I really got attracted to Trump, first of all, it was like the bull in the china shop thing, disillusioned liberal, probably somewhat similar to you. And I was like, just wreck the whole thing. And then eventually, I'm definitely one of those people that started to say, okay, there's no way this guy is falling ass backwards into as many wins as he is. And when I say wins, I don't just mean he's winning elections and he has a lot of money. Like, there's a lot of ways that can happen. But wins in terms of public narrative, like Donald Trump on a long enough timeline emphatically wins the vast majority of public narrative fights that he picks. And what's so interesting about that to me is at the beginning of those fights, it usually does not look that way. Like the initial reaction to Trump's narrative deployments from a mainstream perspective is usually overwhelmingly negative. And that's part of why I wanted to talk to you, because, you're a Canadian and we're going to try to not hold that against you. Are you from Toronto? Because you sound like a Torontonian.
No, I'm actually from Montreal, but we're all groomed on The Simpsons and Seinfeld and American TV, right. So there's a certain homogeneity amongst.
Do you speak French?
English. Oui, je peux débrouiller en français si vous voulez. But it's not real French. Like, if you speak to an actual Parisian this way, they're going to kind of look at you like, "What's wrong with you?" It's
I have heard that Montreal French is very looked down upon. My wife I don't know if you knew this, is one of you.
I heard that.
And,
yes, you were up
she
here
does
a
speak
little while
French as
ago.
well. Yep, she does speak French. I haven't been up there in a little while. I don't know if I'm allowed anymore, but Mrs. Bright knew that. She knew you were in Montreal. Yeah, she lived there for a little while. She speaks French. She's got no accent, kind of like you. So a bit of a spy, bit shifty a little bit when you can speak another language like that, and there's no accent. But, when I lay all that out, it's just to say, I think people in this audience are starting to understand whether or not they fully agree about who's winning or losing narratives, that we're in a war of stories. We're in a war, real, fake, anywhere in between. And one of the major storylines that's happening at the advent of Trump 2.0 is Donald Trump versus the West, is kind of how I've been characterizing it, or the modern incarnation of the West, and specifically Canada. And I want your perspective, before we get into history and all that, I kind of want your perspective just as a lead-in of how do you feel about Trump's deployments specifically with regards to Canada at the beginning of 2025? Has it been surprising to you, funny? What's the temperature among Canadian normies with all this stuff going on?
Oh, a normie is a normie is a normie. So I won't. Yeah, your audience doesn't have to stretch their imagination too far to imagine. I think that overall, I didn't expect that to be deployed so early on, but I find it very entertaining. On the one hand, a little bit dangerous. The place where I think that it's the most useful is in Alberta, probably, where there's the most sort of, it's known as the Texas of Canada. It's the most, I think, any type of crack you might see in this otherwise very tightly controlled structure that is called Canada. It's going to be found in Alberta, maybe to a second degree in the farming zone, blue collar Saskatchewan. You might have a sort of resistance. I don't think, in my experience, most Americans are appreciative enough of this bizarre pseudo country called Canada. They don't understand it. They don't realize how dangerous and this has been as an instrument against the Republic over the course of over 2 centuries. And
the
for
Republic
me, it was,
in the U.S., you mean?
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah.
Canada's been.
Yeah, like Canada itself, it's actually the only monarchy of all of the Americas, first of all. And most Canadians are not even fully aware of that fact. It's a very loosely, if you would ask most Canadians what type of government they think they have, they will tend to answer democracy. Even though
can you explain that? Can you go into that? I don't want to derail you, but wherever you want to go with that, but that is a fascinating thing. And I've lived in Canada for a little while when I was dating my wife, and we had an experience one time where I was making fun of Canadians, as I often do, just giving each other shit, right? They give me shit for being American. Before things got really toxic politically, we could kind of give each other shit. And one of the things I would give Canadian shit about was the Queen being on all the money. And most of them were pretty good-natured about it. But my wife's grandmother one time, who at the time was in her late 80s, she's still kicking, she got really upset about it. Like I was saying, you guys still pledge allegiance to the Queen, and I'm not even thinking much of it. But I'm thinking like, my in-laws, they took it as like, yeah, this is all symbolic. Like to your point, most Canadians think it's all symbolic. The irony is the older generations don't think it's symbolic and like it. But I wonder, you go into what the hell is Canada and what is going on with all of that?
All right, this might be a longer than expected show, and that's okay. It's an important question.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, it's. I'll just say this as an addendum here. I put out a series of books back in the research was done, the writing was done in 2012 and 13, and I turned them into books. So I published them under the Canadian Patriot magazine, a news journal I started back in 2012, because I couldn't get a lot of my research published anywhere else. So I was like, I guess I got to do it myself. And I did for a few years. And then I turned them into a series of 4 books called The Untold History of Canada, volumes 1 to 4. The first one was actually published by a mentor of mine, Pierre Baudry, who tackled all of the books tackle several core, what I call pregnant moments in our throughout our history. Pregnant moments being just like not every moment is the same. Sometimes you got these dense periods of potential where if you screw up and make bad decisions, you can destroy generations by virtue of your foolish decision through stupidity or corruption or whatever. Hence tragedy. You know, when people act tragic at these big pregnant moments, they destroy future generations. When they act untragically, and they get their heads out of their asses and really, really take responsibility for the future and for the world, then, you know, you can get a John F. Kennedy, you can get a Lincoln, you can get somebody who's willing to die for their conscience and their ideals. And that's rare, but really valuable, who takes like the Shakespeare lesson seriously, right? So anyway, I was trying to piece together, because I was doing political activism, and I was trying to make sense of what is this strange thing I'm operating within. At the time, I was a volunteer starting in 2006. I got to say a little bit of backstory to get a sense of like what was I thinking when I was like putting myself on, like, why would I do that? Why would I put myself on the challenge of writing books about Canada when so many books have been written? And the thing I discovered is that it was an American-based political organization that I'd begun volunteering with that was affiliated with Lyndon LaRouche, you know, and there was a small Canadian outlet, small, like maybe 8 or 9 people up in Montreal. And, you know, I was a couple of years into my very depressive New World Order research, chain smoking at one of my smoke breaks. And just thinking, we're screwed. You know, just going,
Black pilling is always the first step to awakening. You just got to keep going through it.
I was just chewing down those heavy, bitter black pills. And in fact, I think at a certain point they got a little sweet, the black pills. It got a little addictive, because the more black they are, the less responsibility we really had. Because it's like, if nothing can be done, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
It's not on me. Yeah, exactly. Just enjoy the dance on the Titanic, you know? So I was enlivened when I found like a little organizing table with some political signs that were trying to attract some discussion with random, you know, pedestrians. And I was one of those pedestrians. And one of the signs attracted my eye, something like "Stop the New World Order," "Stop the Depopulation." And I was like, I could talk about that. So I didn't expect to be challenged by an activist who basically, maybe I thought that they didn't know as much as I did about conspiracies and the subtleties of you know, Freemasonic intrigue and stuff. But at the same time, they were doing something and I wasn't. And they actually had a sense of commitment to solutions that I didn't have. And so I walked away kind of bothered by the fact that I really wasn't doing crap. I didn't have any idea. And so they put forth a few policy proposals that they told me that they were fighting for in Washington, D.C., in Ottawa. And I couldn't deny that those would be good ideas. I didn't think that they would ever possibly happen, like the idea of breaking up Wall Street banks, you know, creating a system of cooperation amongst sovereign nations. For me, I was like, that's over. Maybe we had a chance to talk about that under JFK's time, but it's over. But I started, you know, I was like, okay, I might as well do something. So I started getting into that modality, which was very good for me to do more and more full time. But I was in Canada, and it was a US based organization. And at a certain point, I found myself this frustration was shared by a few other younger members that were up here with me, which was that we were trying to mobilize Canadians to like impeach Dick Cheney, you know, and I'm like, you know, it's kind of like you can only take that so far, you know, or I put the little Hitler mustache on Obama during the Obamacare days and the death panels, and all that's true. But at the same time, it's like, what are you going to, everything, 90% of the people we would talk to would be like, oh, that's very interesting, but we're in Canada. And I'm like, well, that's true. So I was like, well, let's figure out what is this thing? Why do we have a monarchy? What is the structure of command and control within this artifice here? So we started this history work. And that's where volume 1, like I mentioned at the time, I had a very old figure who used to be a professor with the Université de Montréal, Pierre Baudry. He's still got a good website, and there's some good historical research I suggest people check out on there. But his work on Ben Franklin's failure to convince Canadians to become the 14th member to sign the Declaration of Independence during the Continental Congress was a big mind blower for me. I didn't know that Ben Franklin was up here in Canada for 6 weeks. I think it was in April of 1776. And his mission was really to try to persuade anybody with some common sense to say, look, you're French Canadians, you're French speakers, but you got screwed over by the British Empire, just like we've been getting screwed over in the English colonies. Send a delegation down, stand with us, be the 14th colony. And unfortunately, he underestimated the level of Jesuitical Anglican control systems that had been very, very ingratiated into the system of management of Canada, especially even before the 7 Years' War was over.
So even at that time, there was like because I had the impression, not a Canadian historian, but I think Americans have the impression during that era that it was like Canadian fur trappers and French fur trappers, right? You're thinking of like the mountain men, but that's probably more out west. And east, it was more controlled even than the American colonies, such as Boston, etc.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I think that, and it was all the entire economy was intentionally suppressed in both the 13 colonies in the south, as well as the French colony in the north. There was an intentional design to suppress manufacturing, to keep these countries resource extractive only. Every time that there was an effort by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example, to set up the Sawgrass Iron Works in the 17th century, even like way early on, like we're talking here the 1640s, 1650s, it was destroyed. There were laws passed by the British Parliament to ban the right of the colonies to have their own manufacturing, or if they wanted to make textiles or hats or horseshoes, that was destroyed. When it couldn't be banned completely, the market was flooded with cheap product from Britain to just crush local manufacturing. Same thing for Canada. And that was done under we had the French feudal system. So in France, before the French Revolution, France was really a system of very hard Catholic feudalism, where you have a very clearly defined plebeian class of illiterate human talking cows. And then then you had an aristocratic, oligarchy of richer families that had the right to access literacy and culture, but the cultural divide was very stark. Not so much in the case of the English-speaking world; it was still a divide, but not as stark. So in the case of America, you had the Latin farmer. The literacy was remarkably high for the 13 colonies, so they could read Thomas Paine. They could read the Bible, often in original Latin or not original Latin, but in Latin translations, or even sometimes in Greek translations. Not original Greek, which was much more prevalent then than even today. So they could understand philosophically how to think through these bigger ideas of like, what is a republic? Why should I risk my life and my family's security for the idea of a republic? Whereas in Quebec, there was much less literacy. A fraction of the population could read. So Ben Franklin had found that there was a lot of popular sympathy for the American cause amongst the farmers, but except for a few exceptions, he couldn't get people to understand why they should really fight for this thing. And amongst the elites, again, as I mentioned, under the French, it was the Jesuits that had full control. They came in early into the North America, and they began their work as they often do. And there's some good Jesuits, but there's a high level sort of Freemasonic structure, it seems, within the Jesuit order and at the higher chain of command, where they know what the game is. I think it's something that starts smelling a little bit more sulfuric. And they became very good at the art of storytelling and creating stories for native populations that they would go into, whether in Paraguay, whether in Japan, Africa. The natives in North America were no exception. And, what they would be very good at doing was immersing themselves, very, very rigorous quality to learn how the target population would behave, would speak, and they would integrate themselves into the social fabric of that target audience, and then would start utilizing their higher tools of social engineering to gain influence to the point that they would begin to be seen as almost angelic beings that would have dispensations and sacred stories that they would weave for that audience. That would then
so Dune, the plot of Dune is what you're saying. The origins of Canada
that's exactly
are very
what I'm getting
similar
at,
to the plot of Dune.
Yo, dude, the Bene Gesserit are the Jesuits.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
like, yeah, exactly.
He wasn't that subtle about that. Yeah, man, there are so many fucking rabbit holes here.
Yeah.
Is it true? I had read this years and years ago, and it might have been bullshit. Was there, when you're talking about the 14th colony, was there a Battle of Ottawa? Because I had read about this years ago, and then I tried recently to find records on it again and could not. So I don't know if I was just reading a bunch of bullshit. Where there had been attempts by the I don't know what time period this was, but I thought that there was a Battle of Ottawa against the British, and that the sort of 14th colony question was orbiting that. I don't know if you know.
Okay, from what I know about that, is that there were several attempts by the Americans to militarily try to undo this problem of British controls of Canada, because the British really valued this real estate immensely, more than people realize, and they still do, as far as a tool of destabilization of the U.S. So even in 1775, there was a military expedition to try to take Canada. Didn't work. Maybe
that's what I was reading about.
Could have been maybe that, but I think that was more Montreal and Quebec City. That was the focus. I know, you
Quebec City. That's what it was. It was Quebec City. It was not Ottawa.
Oh yeah.
There was a decisive moment of Quebec City where if they had won, and maybe it's what you're talking about. That's what I was reading, that the 14th colony hinged somehow on Quebec City, and things didn't go our way. Whatever that was.
Yeah, that's my friend Gerald Therrien wrote actually a book I published on that story, and he did a better job than anybody that I know. Anton Shakin also is another historian who did a pretty good job on that one, and it seems like that's where all the evidence I've looked at points to the fact that the key figure that sabotaged that operation was Aaron Burr, who found himself playing a big role within the American delegation. They took Montreal pretty easily, but then when they got to Quebec City, it's much more fortified, very difficult garrison to overcome, huge mountain to climb. You're sitting duck. It's like it was bad. But then
super cool place. I want to go there. It's one of the places I did not get to when I was living in Canada. I got to get there.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, a lot of history there. But it seems like Burr played a role with a sort of British counterpart at the time, and it involved inducing the British to generously provide blankets to the cold American soldiers who were freezing because it was very cold at a certain point. The weather turned sour. And for some reason, the decision was made to accept this generous offer. And there was sort of like a germ warfare operation launched. And the American soldiers started getting like dysentery, like all sorts of tuberculosis was spreading, like really, really bad. And the death count started exploding out of hand. And the Americans just crumbled when their leader was shot. And the thing just got aborted. There was another effort in the War of 1812, but that was short-lived. Right. And I think the only time that I've seen any authentic fight from Canadians against the British Empire was, again, somewhat short-lived in 1837 and 1838, which are known as the rebellions of Upper and Lower Canada. At the time, Canada was much smaller. It's not like today. Most of Canada, I'd say like 80% of it was private Hudson Bay land. It was not even in the ownership of the country. It was private land, kind of a subsidiary of the British East India Company. Yeah. Most of Canada was just a little fraction of the south part of Ontario, a little bit of today's Quebec, some of the Maritimes. That's all it was. And so you had a rebellion by this guy, Louis Joseph Papineau, a Republican Quebec leader, and what's his name? William Lyon Mackenzie, who was the mayor of Toronto. A really good guy, I think, who adored Ben Franklin. And both of them saw the failure of their grandparents in screwing up and not accepting the Ben Franklin challenge. And they tried, but they tried, I think, a little bit too prematurely. And they started publishing Thomas Paine. They started publishing in their journals the Declaration of Independence to try to stimulate the fire, But they underestimated the level of social engineering amongst their enemies, especially Lord John Russell was the key guy who was assigned to like put down the rebellions.
Yeah.
And so within 2 seconds, the thing was subverted from within. They had, agents who were deployed to act like heroes and patriots, but just like, pulled the carpet out from under their feet. And then before you know it, the thing turned into a chaotic mess, and the leaders were all hung. Some of them were exiled to, the penal colony of Australia for a few decades. A few others survived and got sanctuary in the U.S. for a bit, like William Lyon Mackenzie got to the U.S. But part of the problem there too is that the British didn't just operate through Canada. They also operated through factions of the Scottish Rite in the North and the South, which had by then had a huge amount of influence in Wall Street in New York. And so if John Quincy Adams was in power still as president, it's likely that they would have had U.S. support to carry out the rebellion. But without U.S. support, they didn't have the ability to fight the empire themselves. And it was Van Buren who actually passed a law. He was president by that time in the U.S. and he passed a law saying it is illegal and you will go to jail if you are an American supporting the Canadians in their fight against the British. We will put you in jail. And that sabotaged all of the sympathy that the Canadians had with people in Buffalo or New York or Boston who just didn't want to go to jail. Some of them did still take the risk, but not many.
Yeah. It's amazing, that stuff, and obviously you're a historian, the little things that we don't know about that are massive. Like, and of course I always give people shit for it, but when you mentioned John Quincy Adams, those Boston boys, like there's a lot of rose-colored glasses by Americans assigned to the revolution, of course, and to everyone in it, I should say. I think there should be rose-colored glasses on the revolution. I mean, it is what it is, right? Like, as an idea, it's still enduring in many ways, still informs a lot of the resurgence, I think, that we're seeing in the idea of Americanism. One of the things I've said along quite a bit to this audience, because most of this audience, 90% of it, are sort of reformed Bush voters, right? Like, they're conservatives. Most of them are lifelong American conservatives, voted for the Bush regime, maybe voted for Romney, etc., but have recognized that they were duped into that stuff, just like I've recognized that Obama was a dupe and, everything pretty much going back to JFK. But, for a lot of the founding fathers who maybe weren't the greatest, or we might look at a little bit differently, and some of those initial few presidents, the Boston boys, I like. The more I look into them, obviously I grew up in Boston, and we're taught about the Adams and everything like that, or at least we were when I was a kid. Now maybe they're all persona non grata. I'm sure the Boston Tea Party is just described as like some racist blackface event at this point. But I love reading about a lot of those guys, because for the InfoWar perspective on history, so often you look back and you're like, man, him too, right? Like, you have that black pill thing where you're like, this motherfucker, like, I thought this was one of our guys. And I will say that many of the Boston boys, you look back at them and you're like, nope, he was a savage and remained a savage like throughout his life. So I like hitting the conservative audience with that a lot, because like they shit all over Massachusetts, and I get it. But, there's a lot of like revisionist history of the South, and like, we were the real Americans. Meanwhile, Bostonians were besieging the British in their own city for like a year before they pretty much forced the other Americans into a war. But when it comes to Canada too, we mentioned Dune. Ash was in the chat. I know she's working on the Substack now. But she was like, do I actually have to read that nerdy shit, Dune? I love that you brought that up, because for all the like bombastic, visual splendor and the genre fiction shit that I love of the Dune universe, what that is really about is a masterclass in narrative seeding and prophetic seeding, and the juxtaposition, or the tension between when does a myth become... when does a story become reality? When does a story become history? When is a myth real? When is it not? Can a myth be more real than the real story because of the, effects it actually ends up having, right? Like, the whole idea in Dune is that Paul is the Messiah, and that's all the story. But if enough people believe it, it sort of becomes true. So from what you're saying about the origins of Canada compared to the US, is your kind of macro estimation that there was something in the American colonies, maybe in the Americans of the time, that was fundamental? I know you said there was subversion in Canada, right? But there was also subversion in the US. Was there something specific to Canada that made those people of the time just not take that extra step? Like, do you think it was just that they were hit harder with the subversion? Or was there something fundamentally different about Americans compared to those Canadians that kind of made that made them kind of go in those different directions?
Yeah, I think that part of, as you've been alluded to, myths. We've got some very insidious and powerful national myths in Canada that have been carefully concocted and that are total lies, but they're powerful. And part of that is that there's been this, well, one, our founding fathers, going back to even before the 1867 Confederation, which was where we had the British North America Act, which is sort of known as the Canadian, the founding of modern Canada was this 1867 British North America Act. That's our constitution. Now, those founding fathers were pro-British Empire social engineers, and just generally, when you look into each one of their lives, just terrible people by and large. People you would consider traitors to any national cause. But their loyalties were to the British Empire's health and security globally, not to the people. And they even included that in the Constitution's preamble itself, that the purpose of creating a Confederation of Canada would be to support and promote the interests of the British Empire. It's literally there in words.
It's amazing that it's just right there.
Yeah. And it's got an enshrined Privy Council office. It's got enshrined lieutenant governors, all loyal to the system of hereditary power that would be located across the ocean. And that even to this very day, I would say, gets you closer to what is actually making real decisions. The part of the elected government that's codified around the House of Commons, modeled on the British House of Commons, is actually a very derogatory thing. I mean, the Commons is just another way of saying it's a house for the commoners. It's a very the plebs, So it's a very, very two-tiered system in that sense, with the illusion of democracy, with none of the actual reality of being able to influence things as a commoner. Very little. And if you try to do something that's subverted the designs of the City of London, the older families of the oligarchy that have their own intention, then you will find yourself, you might find that policy being thwarted by the Governor General, who's the official hand of the monarch that has to give royal assent or royal descent to any act before it becomes law. And they will do something. Or you could have, like the Australians, who have a similar situation discovered in 1974, that Gough Whitlam, their elected prime minister, who started trying to do something to resist the Five Eyes, and he kicked out, the CIA annex in Australia, got fired by the Queen's Governor General. I think his name was John Kerr, just because, for no reason. And nobody asked another question like, hey, why did that happen? What the hell do we have in our system that allows that to happen? So, but even before that, Canada was founded even, 80, 90 years earlier in 1776 by United Empire Loyalists, who were the ruling nobles of the colonies who wanted to remain loyal to the British Empire. And so they got rightfully kicked out of the 13 colonies, but they were given kind of like what London did to the Russian oligarchs who got kicked out of Russia under Putin. They got sanctuary in England. Same thing for the British, saying, well, we've got this territory here in Canada. You can rebuild your dynasties in Canada, and we'll create new stories to make you seem like heroes for standing true and firm to your British principles. So
we call those Ukrainians.
Yeah, right. There's like different variations of the same theme.
Yeah.
So, you got these characters that became known in the early days as the family compact, because it was observed by people like William Lyon Mackenzie that all of those overlords managing like 95% of the land and the production and the economy in Canada in the 1820s, 30s, they were all inbred, intermarrying families, just like you had in the case of the U.S. It's the same as the U.S. became more corrupted into its aristocratic sort of tendencies. Same thing for Canada, but Canada, it's more. That's all it was. It was never there was never like bright shining other tradition representing something good. You didn't have. There's no example of that, and so we were given this story generation after generation in our schools, and I was given that in high school, that we are British, even though we sound American, we are British, which is a mark. It's supposed to be seen as a mark of pride because we fought to defend our British principles against all of these American imperialistic takeovers that were attempted, and that it's listed, right? 1649, John Winthrop Jr. was trying to 1649. There was an attempt by John Winthrop of Massachusetts to take Canada and break it free of the empire. That was already being done.
Yeah, you're welcome for the attempt, by the way. No thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
No, yeah,
I thank you. I appreciate the effort.
You got to come to GART Plymouth. You haven't been at a single GART, and if you're going to go to one, you should go to GART Plymouth. It's in like 6 weeks. We got
6 weeks.
We got all kinds of history going on, but that's actually relevant. I mean, as you know, if you've seen a couple episodes of this show, we always end up diverting into stuff that we weren't going to talk about. But this stuff is fascinating to me. So, what I'm kind of picking up by what you're saying about Canada, the U.S., the origin points, I like that you're going with the story angle. Obviously, I love that for this show. It feels to me like the British Empire, if we're using them as the deep state, the power structure of that time, everybody would agree with that, right? Not really tied to a nation, but more of the empire. The British East India Company was more powerful than the British country, right? It feels like maybe the U.S. had gotten out of control very quickly, like before it was the U.S. The American colonies had kind of gotten out of control. And it sounds to me, by what you're saying, the Canadian colonies didn't quite get out of control, and the attempt by the British Empire to head that off was really aggressive in Canada. Like they had already almost lost the story in the colonies south. So, and it's hard to make this point, but something that I've said on this show before in various ways, and it's interesting to bounce off of you, is that I started to realize the fundamental differences between me and Canadians during the COVID era. I had lived up there. I met my wife as Canadian. Like you just mentioned, like, hey, you sound American, you seem American, most of you act basically American. Maybe Americans are like a little more boisterous, right? Like a little bit more like rah-rah nationalistic, even before the Trump era. But during COVID, I started to realize that even East Coasters and Northeastern Americans do have a concept of basic rights, like that radiate outward from the individual. And it feels like a lot of Canadians do not fundamentally believe that. Because I remember I was talking to Canadians, friends at the time, who I thought were going to be super against lockdowns and vaccines, etc. And even if they kind of agreed with what I was saying, they would hit me with like, well, yeah, but the government said to do it. So how did you just not do it? Yeah. And I'm like, because we have rights. Like you don't actually have to do this and that thing. And to loop this back into the stories, when you mentioned the story of Canada, does it seem like the powers that be sort of tried to mimic the American story with the Canadian story, even though like they disguised the fact that it was the British Empire because they knew that if you had the American country below it, there'd be this constant comparison game, and maybe Canadians would have gotten sick of it long before now. So that when you're going through school and everything, you seem to be taught in a very similar way of Americans. You seem to be taught that, hey, we have our unalienable rights and we're a democracy. So, you see that as all intentional kind of engineering, like you said, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that the way that they crafted this narrative for Canadians to make us sort of, and because what does it even mean to be a Canadian? If you ask most Canadians, what does that even mean? There's not clear answers you're going to get. Like an American, you've got a sense of, being a part of a society that was founded upon freedom. Most Americans can even recite certain opening remarks at the very least of the Declaration of Independence and or the Constitution. There's a sort of pride of being American, regardless of what part of the U.S. you're from, that is universal, right? Something viable. You could look at the flag and say, okay, there's a meaning for those stripes and those stars. There's something that has more than simply symbolic value. Whereas when you ask a Canadian, and I've done it, I was a political organizer for 10 years, and part of my attempting to try to assist my fellow Canadians in being more self-aware was to just simply ask them, like, what does it even mean to you? Can you recite anything of your Constitution? Do you have a Constitution? That's going
to be one of my questions to you is, what is a Canadian? So that's great.
And
what's the story of a Canadian?
More often than not, the answer would be either something super ephemeral and unsubstantiative, like, we like Tim Hortons, we're polite, we like hockey. It's like, okay, is that really something to found a national identity on? What's our flag mean? Red and white with a maple leaf. What is the meaning of that? Most countries, Algeria and others, that they have flags that have some meaning that is infused with a freedom fight, some ideals. Whereas the Canadian flag, it's literally what it means is a maple leaf. We have a lot of maple trees. Okay, great. Those are tasty. It's maybe a one of the proofs that God is good, perhaps, that trees bleed sugar. Okay. But, that's not really, again, all that much. And you usually, again, one of the deeper invariants is that we're not American. We're not Canadian, and it's a negative. So you're like, that's usually, there's this hostility that most Canadians outside of Alberta tend to feel against Americans in the South, is that we're not you. So we knew that just by being patient, we would have freedoms given to us that we wouldn't have to fight over or risk our lives over. And so it's created a situation where that, combined with this fake narrative that we have defended ourselves from American imperialism, has created this insane, irrational fear that Americans want to steal our stuff, or they want to steal our water. They want to steal our land. Now, ironically, despite having that craziness in the head that's been put there, we still sold it all off under NAFTA, under the last 35 years.
Yeah, we've got it all anyway.
We allowed it to happen. So it actually didn't prevent that, but that only happened after the US got more and more colonized after the murder of JFK by the Bilderberger Group agencies. Henry Kissinger was a steering committee member of the Bilderberger Group, which is a globalist organization founded in 1954 to sort of coordinate as much power within leading figures who managed much of the private sector and the banking sector that would then infiltrate and take control of the nation states of the world with a focus on the USA. And so in the decades after JFK was murdered, there was, I guess, a decision made in the early 80s that, okay, things are sufficiently under the control of an agency that has no bearing upon the will of the American people that we can now begin to loosen these anti-American laws that the Canadians had invoked for decades, because there were laws since the 60s that Pierre Elliott Trudeau, a Fabian Society socialist who was working with a bunch of Rhodes scholars from Oxford, they passed laws preventing American companies to own more than like 10% of a Canadian company. You couldn't publish American journals or magazines in Canada by law from the late 50s up until the 80s. They had quotas, unless you were like maybe Time or Fortune or Reader's Digest. That got exemptions, but otherwise you couldn't. So they really worked hard to try to create a false anti-American culture by law, central planning for the Canadians. What do you call it? The National Film Board was created to start promoting, with taxpayer money, Canadian-based productions of film and theater plays that would start reinforcing an identity that would not be American. Because the empire was always afraid for 250 years that the Canadians would look in a sober way, with sober eyes, at how much better life was in a land where freedom was actually held to be intrinsic to all. And we would want that ourselves. At our better moments, we did want that, but that's been such a paranoia by the empire that they put so much effort into trying to stave that off. And I'll throw one quote at you that I think is really valuable on this point, which was delivered in 1909 by this fellow named Lord Alfred Milner, who, do you know Lord Milner?
Nope.
He's the guy who ran Cecil Rhodes's Roundtable movement. So he was, you know Cecil Rhodes, right?
No, was he the Rhodes Scholars?
He's the founder of the Rhodes Scholars, yeah.
Right.
Right.
So I don't know a lot about his history, but yeah.
Okay, that's sort of like one of the master keys for one of my books on the origins of the deep state of North America was looking into the Rhodes Scholarship as like this mercenary class of indoctrinated sociopaths who are given scholarships to get brainwashed in Oxford and then are redeployed back into different parts of the world.
Divide and conquer. They end up in the Prussian sort of corporatocracy.
Yeah. And this guy, Lord Milner, came to Canada when it was becoming clear in 1909 that we had a leader here who was an admirer of Lincoln and who wanted to use the Lincoln example to create a special relationship with the U.S. with what's known as like a customs union with a protective tariff around all of Canada and the USA and internal national development within the continent to have a continental policy of real production and industrial progress. And that guy's name was Wilfrid Laurier. He got ousted by a coup d'etat run by the Freemasonic Orangemen and the Roundtable Movement of Ontario in 1911, right before he could sign into law this customs union. But this crisis that Wilfrid Laurier was creating in the empire was huge. And Lord Milner, who was at the time, again, the top dog in charge of this Rhodes Trust, their think tanks became known as the Council on Foreign Relations in America. In Britain, it was Chatham House, still very powerful.
Yeah.
And Council on Foreign Relations, that's the British Roundtable movement. So he wrote back to one of his fellow Roundtable handlers describing three possibilities for the future. And he says, and I'm going to quote him directly, because I think it's just so useful to get into the psychology of these social engineers, saying, as between the three possibilities of the future, which is number one, closer imperial union, number two, union with the USA, and number three, independence. So closer imperial union is like integrating all of the branches of the British Empire into like one federation with one command and control instead of allowing the different colonies to have a little bit of independence. No, get rid of that, integrate it. And that's still something that King Charles is gearing up right now, just like we have with Mario Draghi and the EU technocrats, with which Mark Carney is part of. They're gearing up to have more of a centralized command and control in Europe and Canada too. That's what he's talking about with number one. Number two is union of Canada with the USA, and number three is independence for Canada. He says, quote, I believe definitely that number two, that is union with the USA, is the real danger. I do not think the Canadians themselves are aware of it. They are wonderfully immature in political reflection on the big issues, and hardly realize.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and hardly realize how powerful the influences are. On the other hand, I see little danger to ultimate imperial unity in Canadian nationalism, and he does this little like air quote for nationalism. On the contrary, I think the very same sentiment makes a great many, especially of the younger Canadians, vigorously and even bumptiously assertive of their independence, proud and boastful of the greatness and future of their country and so forth, would lend themselves, tactfully handled, to an enthusiastic acceptance of imperial unity based on partner states. He does air quotes again. This tendency is therefore, in my opinion, rather to be encouraged, not only as a safeguard against Americanization, but as actually making, in the long run, a union of all the Britons. So I thought that's exactly what they did. Yeah. Everybody has been following, who's been managing the Canadian system of controls and creating this fake pseudo country with a fake maple leaf flag and national anthem that really, some nice words in it, but it's very vapid otherwise. They've been operating
shitty
on
melody
that
too.
Huh?
Shitty melody too, to be honest, of the national anthem. No, man, that is incredible. What year was that quote? 1909.
He was working with Halford Mackinder. So him and Mackinder from the Fabian Society, the London School of Economics, both of them came down together on the Rhodes Trust money to Canada to figure out how do they get rid of this Laurier guy and how do they start inflaming this false nationalism. And Mackinder is very clear when he's in Canada and he writes a few reports for the British Empire. He's very clear that the danger is U.S.-Russian relations, that's the danger. So it's Germany, Russia, France, and the USA who all have this tradition of working to cooperate on industrial progress against the wishes of the City of London and this other evil thing inside of Prussia. And Canada they see as a valuable wedge to prevent any dangerous emergence of U.S.-Russian collaboration around rail development of Alaska and the Arctic more generally. So they're very clear on that too.
Well, I know you're in parts unknown right now. I want to keep you for longer to talk about that part of things. Just give me just raise the white flag like a true Canadian when you need to get off. But I'll start trying to transition in that direction. But that point you just made on those quotes from Rhodes, it's incredible because on a couple different levels. For starters, and I've got Canadian family, Canadian in-laws, etc. So sometimes they watch the shows, a lot of times they don't. But man, even in 2024 and before, like even if you take Trumpism and everything out of it, something that I have said to Canadians and to my American friends and family about Canadians is summed up in what you just said. Before even getting to the political stuff, Canada's national identity, I love that you said it's a negative. Their identity is not being American. It's very well put. And man, I lived there for 2 years and then have been there a million times. My wife and I dated for years and years before she made the correct choice and became American. But before you could just walk across the border to do it, she did it the old-fashioned way. But man, there is a small dog syndrome, and I don't know how common that saying is. I don't know if that's just unique to Boston. I think that's a pretty widespread saying, but essentially I was a short guy, right? Small dog syndrome. You talk a lot of shit. You get really quick-witted. You get quick at hitting people with comebacks. And you're usually the first one to throw a punch because you got to show people yeah, I'm small, but I'll fuck you up. Right. And I feel like Canadians, man, so many of them are good natured when you start talking some smack back and forth, but you'll hit those Canadians that if you say anything, it's like you've hit the red button and have discovered that there's no national identity at all. There's nothing there. It's it's hockey memes. It's Maple Leafs. It's a vague superiority complex about how barbaric Americans are. And I noticed this even before the advent of Trump. I started dating my future wife in 2012. And even at that time, when I was an American liberal, an Obama voter, and I would go up there not seeing myself as a nationalist because I was super disillusioned on the U.S., super anti the war in the Middle East. And man, I would find myself getting annoyed at Canadians because they'd be like, yeah, you guys are a bunch of idiots and you're just bombing the Middle East. And I'm like, well, yeah, I agree with you on all of that. But eventually I would end up in these bars in Toronto just yelling at Canadians by saying you guys literally realize that everything you're saying about America is also you because you just follow us around for you're like the little brother on the playground that we protect. And you follow us around, talk shit about us all the time, have followed us into every conflict ever when you didn't follow the British Empire into it first. But getting more of the historical perspective on it is eye-opening to your point because it's not just small dog syndrome. It's actually really dark for Canadians. And when I try to red pill them and want to use some of this material to say when you guys are being anti-American, you are falling into the globalist story that they have told you about what a Canadian is, right? And it's the perfect, you used the word wedge. It's not only a wedge, to me, it's the perfect nation of what the British Empire wants everywhere to be, right? You're going to be part of the British Empire, but we're going to give you a story that gives you this vague sense of national pride. As long as you kind of stay in line and don't get off the reservation, so to speak. And it seems like they're trying to replicate this with other countries, but Canada, would you agree that, I mean, Canada is one of the most successful globalist experiments that they've had, if not the most successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I think when you look at, as you noted, the cultural tendency to, and I mean, we saw this break a little bit, and thank God again for Alberta, where you actually had a freedom-loving movement that was sufficient and capable enough of launching what became the Freedom Convoy that invoked, I think, a sense of something innately true that people forgot to think about, which was invoked through the Freedom Convoy's actions. And then, you know, you had 7-8 million Canadians all realize, oh yeah, right, this is wrong. We can do something about that, which was great. And it just shows you how much easier it would be to awaken that sense of natural law within us if we actually had proper leadership. It wouldn't take that much. It takes a lot more effort to try to enforce systems that presume that rights are just given to us or can be taken away, but there's nothing intrinsic, which is what we have in any Commonwealth type of country. That was nice. But overall, yeah, the tendency, the behavioral tendency of adaptation to systems of injustice, as long as there's some comfort, there has to be some comfort. That's something that the British love, the fact that we're so willing to acquiesce to a system where individuals don't have a say in the way the system is actually orchestrated, as long as there's comfort. And the population density, you know, it's like the biggest landmass of a country, or the second biggest in the world, but the population density is something like less than 3 people per kilometer square, which is remarkably low. Like less than 40 million people live in this giant land of Canada, which there are cities in this world, like the greater Hong Kong area, that have more people, or greater Tokyo area, I should say, that have more people than all of Canada. You know, California, more people than Canada. So they like, and most of the, I'd say 92% of those people live within 100 kilometers of the US border. In 7 cities, you know, and everybody else is highly diffused elsewhere, you know. The natives have been so manipulated and messed up by social engineering, from Jesuits to British imperial controllers, that they don't even realize how they've been used in reserves, almost like human flagpoles on geopolitical chess pieces to prevent development of the Arctic by manipulating their various tribal leaders and other representatives that are usually getting money from deep organized crime syndicates, often affiliated with, ironically, mining cartels like Peter Monk's Barrick Gold, and other agencies that are funding the brainwashing of young elite natives and Inuits, especially in Western Toronto universities, to become radicalized, kind of like what they do to leadership of the Banderites in Ukraine or other places, and then are redeployed to like run a color revolution in some countries, or in the case of Canada, to enforce this zero growth ideology, which posits that the native culture is anti-technological progress, that's for the evil, corrupt European people is technological progress, but because we've been told that we are just pure, we're of a different culture that prizes stasis and cherishing nature. And that was never true. That was done there to brainwash people on all and keep the whole continent backwards and underdeveloped. And you could see that when you look at a place which has Inuits, like in Russia, also has Inuits. They have igloos, similar cultural dynamics in the Russian Arctic, except they have not suffered through generations of Jesuitical and British manipulation, and they're much more healthy, much less drug use, infant mortality, alcoholism, much more like psycho-spiritually healthy people who are happy to learn new skills without losing their culture or without losing their language. They dichotomy. We've been told that there's this dichotomy, and so you've got all of that going on. So we have certainly this that the British Empire definitely, you're right, looks to Canada as a role model of what they would like the entire world to be organized around. I totally agree with that. Low population density, complacent population, happy to have other people, unelected bureaucrats making decisions for us. They want, I think you're right. And I think one of the scenarios that's in play on a certain level that people should just have on their radar is, I think that And in no way do I believe that this is necessarily going to happen, but it's something to be aware of. There's more likelihood that this will happen in the long run if we're not looking at it. The Prince Harry, Meghan Markle drama, which I think some players of the chessboard are setting up a situation for over a decade in the future where they would like either a President Markle or President Harry.
Oh my goodness. Just take the mask off completely, right? And just have Canada be the little princeling of the British Empire.
Yeah. That is, I think, one of the fights right now. Like I'm for a continental republic with a real like a real honest, authentic focus on cooperation, development that's going to benefit everybody. I'm for that type of integrated, like Canada should, if that's the dynamic, I think we should become the 51st state. If, however, they do a sleight of hand and make America more Canadian, then I think you could get a bait and switch, at which point, let's say with a crisis condition, I think there are certain agencies that do have influence that created a fake drama around Meghan Markle saying, I don't want to be a part of this Windsor family. They're racist. And, her PR person is the same PR person who worked for Hillary Clinton in 2016, is also working for Meghan Markle to sort of like control her image. Harry said, I'm going to get rid of all of my royal titles and hereditary titles. I want to be more Republican. I think that they're creating a narrative to act upon later on as part of a reconquering of the United States. That's a danger that I see in play.
Yeah, it's great to look at that stuff. And, you can see, if you pay attention to the story structure, you can see it being seeded. And this is why, I've said many, many times, like the people that are sudden counterculture mass figures that are pushed by mainstream media as counterculture or counter empire, those are the ones you probably want to keep your eye on. I see a couple people in the chat like saying, okay, I'm shitting on Canada to a Canadian. Obviously, guys, to the two of you that were mad in the chat, all the things we're talking about, we've talked about with Americans a million times, right? There's a context here of saying like, it's not like anybody watching these shows who's an American feels great about what the United States has been turned into or was turned into for so long. Like I always use the "we are the baddies" meme, and that's what kind of led me down into the whole Russian history rabbit hole and everything. So it's not to say that Canadians are inherently worse or anything like that. I think more what we're touching on is the positive thing about the U.S. is I think the advent of Trump, whatever people think of him, like flaws and all, I think what the advent of the Trump story and the sort of dominance of the Trump story has demonstrated is that there was this seed still, this core of Americanism in the hearts of Americans, of many Americans, that just needed this little bit of light, this little bit of daylight to kind of come all the way back out. And it's been positive, I think, not just because it's like, okay, yeah, American pride, flag waving. I've said before on the show, as an American, I had a very negative feeling when I would see the American flag 20 years ago because I associated it with Bushism, Jingoism, the wars in the Middle East, right? And only in recent years did I start flying one on my house, on my barn. And, kind of feeling like, okay, you know what? No, we can take this shit back, right? Like, the LGBT movement took the rainbow. Like what? So gay people own colors now, right? Like we got to cede that away to some agenda. So I think that we're just remarking that the Canadian people, of course there's based Canadians. Matt's one of them. He's at Badlands Media. But I do think that small dog syndrome holds them back. I want to hit you though with a weird white pill to twist that around on Canada. Before I do, I want to thank the primary sponsor of this show, and that is our friends at Save Pulse. Save Pulse is committed to keeping you and your family healthy with top quality medications like amoxicillin, azithromycin, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and more. Our ordering process is streamlined for your convenience, and we pride ourselves on offering unbeatable prices. Now's the time to prepare for any health scenario. Head over to badlandsmedia.tv/meds to stock up on essential antibiotics and viral care medications. Ensure you're ready for anything by visiting badlandsmedia.tv/meds. Don't forget to use the promo code Badlands at checkout to get a 10% discount on orders over $150. badlandsmedia.tv/meds, promo code Badlands, 10% off orders over $150. Okay, Matt, how much longer do I have you for in real terms? Like,
you do half an hour.
Half an hour?
Do
Okay,
half an hour?
let's try to... One more Canada point, and then I want to get a couple things on the real shit that's going on. And I'll get to have you back on the show. So
and I got a thing on... Yeah, okay.
What?
I got a little thing on Carney at some point. I'm going to want to play a 2-minute video on Carney before the 30 minutes are over. Just keep that in mind.
Okay, so we'll go, after this, we'll go into the Carney thing. So my weird white pill on Canada, everything we just said, and everything you've talked about, the story, the engineering, the social engineering, maybe I give him too much credit as a storyteller, but I personally believe Donald Trump knows what he's doing with his narrative deployments. And I think his Canadian narrative deployments have been hilarious. And I think that they are provoking the desired outcome. I wonder your perspective on this angle in particular. I'm not talking about the tariffs, like we've talked about that stuff a million times, the nuances of the economic fallout, purely from a narrative perspective. Something I see here is when I see viral videos in Canada of Canadians pouring out Jack Daniels to own the Americans because of Trump's tariffs, I sat back and started laughing and thinking, Donald Trump's story that he is projecting to the world is unabashed, unapologetic Americanism, right? Nationalism, sovereignty. We are going to leverage American power projection. We're going to do what's best for us. You know, there's no such thing as friends or allies anymore, whatever people think of that. The irony is, when I see the pushback from Canadians on that messaging, I think that Trump would like to see that, because what it feels like is what's maybe been missing a little bit is this idea of Canadian nationalism. But I wonder if you see any positives there, and leading into, strangely, to set you up for the Carney point, if anybody wants to call me a doomer, this is your clip to show that I am not. In fact, I'm probably too far the other way. When I see the Canadians respond to Trump's Truth Social prodding when he's saying, why is Justin Trudeau still in office or still speaking on behalf of the Canadian people? And then a few days later, they're like, whoops, and they swap him out for a literal central banker. I see that as comedic and positive, but I'm a very big proponent of accelerationism. But I wonder how you see it when you tell the Americans in the audience, who the hell is Mark Carney? Is there any white pill here toward sort of sovereign accelerationism going on, or are the Canadians just off the rails?
Unfortunately, I'm not as optimistic about the Canadian dynamic as you. What I will do, and definitely there is a Canadian nationalism heating up based on what Trump has said. Like, that's true. I've never personally in my living memory experienced what I'm now noticing. But at the same time, I don't see it as... I see it as a desire to recapture a forgotten bad thing. Like, our nationalism was always, as far as I've researched it, 95% of the time, the character of what I'm seeing being revived is a British social engineering fake story of deeper, virulent anti-Americanism, and not a real Canadian nationalism, the likes of which I'm talking about with William Lyon Mackenzie or Louis-Joseph Papineau, or, you know, we had a few good people in the 20th century who actually got murdered as premiers of provinces. Like Daniel Johnson Sr. was a friend of de Gaulle, a friend of Bobby Kennedy, who was premier of Quebec. His deputy premier also got murdered in 1970, which justified martial law. They were friends of America, and they really had a very healthy idea of becoming a republic, and like for the right reasons. Again, one of them got poisoned, the other one got strangled to death and like left in his car in 1970 by a Gladio Nazi-run operation of French fascists that were working in Quebec with Pierre Elliott Trudeau and the CIA. So I mean, what I'm seeing revived is not the Daniel. I'll just say sorry. Yeah, it's Aldo Moro. It's so I'm not seeing that healthier version right now being revived. I'm seeing the more like Pierre Elliott Trudeau type, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau has been sold to us as sort of the Lincoln of Canada, who kept Canada together in thick and thin, even was strong enough to bring tanks to the streets of Montreal in 1970 to keep us safe and secure. And he stopped the referendum that was trying to have that almost had the French Canadians secede in 1980 and 1995. It was Pierre Elliott Trudeau who kept us together. And so you've got this Trudeau for me is like a Satanist. Like that guy that's what I'm seeing sort of being revived in the incarnation of Mark Carney. So to make a long story short, I have a more negative view of what's being invoked as something that's going to make Canadians much more unwieldy, I fear, as far as taking on a continental mission, which I believe we should do in a healthy way with Russia and China as our allies opening the Arctic. That would be a great future for us. But I'm not seeing that right now. And with Carney, I'll just say one thing. I got that video that you set me up for, so I'll just play it, and it's short. Here we are. And let me just hit play and make sure there's... Oh, is there sound? Is there sound? Let me go see if there's sound.
There should be.
All right, let's try it.
I, Mark Carney, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty.
Can you hear that?
Yeah. It just messed up
for
a second,
can you hear him
but
speak?
I think we're good.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just go back a little bit.
Do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty, King Charles III, King of Canada, his heirs and successors. I, Mark Carney, do solemnly and sincerely swear that I shall be a true and faithful servant to His Majesty King Charles III as a member of His Majesty's Privy Council for Canada. I will, in all things, to be treated, debated, and resolved in Privy Council, faithfully, honestly, and truly declare my mind and my opinion. I shall keep secret all matters committed and revealed to me in this capacity, or that shall be secretly treated of in council. Generally, in all things I shall do as a faithful and true servant ought to do for His Majesty.
That's adequate. That's sufficiently adequate.
Now, I just want to be clear that when I say this is a white pill, I fully agree with everything you're saying. I'm just saying, if we are in an era of accelerationism, I would rather the Canadian globalists, also known as the British Empire, install a literal central banker who pledges allegiance to the British crown on TV rather than somebody trying to brand themselves as like a new Canadian nationalist. So it's like, I think you're 100% dead on in what you're saying here, but one has to think Trump knew this is coming, because I mean, he's been playing with his food, Justin Trudeau, for a while, and it's almost like last week he put that post out being like, all right, now let's get the next one up. Like, stop speaking for the Canadian people, stop trying to stay in fake power. Let's get the next one in so I can start going back and forth. But man, I mean, for anybody who doesn't know, and you've probably mentioned this on your show, but Matt behind the scenes has been saying that this was the play by the Canadian globalists, by the British Empire for a long time. I mean, you've seen this coming for a long, long time. And man, I mean, it looks like this is just a full mask off. Like, we are not going to even pretend to not be a subject of the British Empire, I guess, anymore.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, in Carney's strange defense, what he did there is done by every single prime minister and shadow cabinet member forever. That's part of what you have to do. And that pledge of the oaths of secrecy to keep secret all things that shall be told in Privy Council, and his loyalty to King Charles and his heirs into perpetuity, it's there for both public sector officials who will be granted some form of influence over policy, as well as private sector. Maurice Strong was Privy Councillor. Charles Bronfman, never elected to anything, but they were Privy Council members. So it's pretty much anybody who's going to be put into play on the chess piece that will be granted access to information. that might be sensitive, they have to pledge their oaths of secrecy, and otherwise the implications of breaking that are very, very big. You don't want to do that. So that's in his defense. But at the same time, Carney, I did my first deep dive on Carney back in 2013. Had a whole video on him for my Canadian Patriot back then, and when he wrote, he started expressing his interest after he finished up as governor of the Bank of England and returned to Canada. He already gave an interview in 2020 expressing his interest to the possibility of becoming prime minister. And, so I just listened to what he said and looked at how well positioned he was and how much favor he must have had amongst very sociopathically powerful figures to say, yeah, they want to make him prime minister. It's like it wasn't crystal ball gazing or nothing, just looking at what he says. And like Chrystia Freeland, a Rhodes Scholar, is still deputy prime minister. He is the godfather of one of her kids. These guys are both Oxford indoctrinated. I guess the heirs of Cecil Rhodes and Lord Milner, but also Mario Draghi, right? Like Ursula von der Leyen in Europe, gave a speech endorsing the Draghi plan to create a savings and investment union to centralize control and steal people's savings. They want to steal $300 of savings of European families to then put into rebuilding the industrial base of a military war economy to fight Russia in Europe. And so Carney's been on board with, he's the architect of that design with Draghi. Both of them are Goldman Sachs men. Both of them worked together on the Financial Stability Board for the Bank of International Settlements. At the same time, overseeing the growth of global derivatives, like the trigger of the time bomb of our banking system, is what these guys oversaw the growth of. So they've got a certain amount of insight into the big joke of the whole thing. And both of them put the bail-in, this is known as the bail-in regime. Instead of bailing out banks next time there's a crisis, they want to set the stage to just steal people's deposits and then convert it into green bonds, things to advance the windmills, solar paneling of the world. In this case, now
they're all
Russia
unused. They're all unused savings, man. I don't know why you're getting all bent out of shape about it. It's like if your savings are just sitting there, right? That's the
argument, right?
The reason the Carney thing I think was so funny to me is because it feels like for anybody who doesn't know, he was the Bank of Canada guy, Bank of England guy, which I didn't know that. And it would be like, I can't imagine, although I can, that Canadians are just like, yeah, this seems totally cool and normal. I feel like even a lot of normie Americans, if you made Jerome Powell the president, they'd be like, this seems like it's maybe not the best idea. Like this maybe seems like the conspiracy theorists are right. They always try to maintain some level of separation, at least in the narrative, between the government and the central bank. Where in Canada, that's what, when I say it's a mask off moment, it feels to me very bold in this current sort of nationalist conversation to be like, you know what? The U.S. is entering a new age of nationalism, like hyper-nationalism. And what we're going to do is put the Bank of Canada, Bank of England guy in there, and whose greatest ally is Ursula von der Leyen, right? I mean, it's just, it's darkly comedic, but you kind of have to take it that way.
I do laugh. I think it's hilarious as well. But like I said, I'm seeing that there does seem to be a successful orchestration of a narrative somehow in Canada that has posited that this guy really is a heroic figure. There's not enough Canadians that I'm seeing who recognize the absurdity of it to make me confident that this is playing in the favor of the good guys. So we'll see.
Canadians
he's
like
going to call an election, they say, huh?
Yeah. Canadians, in my experience, like banks, like have a high opinion of
we do. No, that's the thing. Like, and we were told, because he was the governor of the Bank of Canada for a number of years during the big economic crisis that hurt so many people so badly and ruined so many lives. And this image was concocted that he is the savior of Canada. And most Canadians, I think, outside of Alberta, tend to have bought into this idea that we are the clean, conservative banking model. We don't do subprimes. We do clean conservative banking. And it's not true. It's just that we have more opacity and less regulatory demands to showcase what the banks are actually doing to launder international money, from Scotiabank's offshore, accounts in the Cayman Islands to HSBC's operations in Canada that run with RBC, the Royal Bank of Canada, biggest bank. These things run international narcotics and money laundering that go into all sorts of insidious activities, but there's no laws that demand that they have to be transparent, as there are more of those laws in the United States' case. So we can get away with lying more.
Right.
And thus the image has been successfully conveyed that Carney is this clean, responsible, patriotic guy. I'm time will tell. And they say he's going to call an election to try to legitimize his position. We'll see if he does, and we'll see what the turnout is. And I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
I hope you're right.
To your points about the banks too, TD Bank last year got rolled up in the anti-terrorism,
drug laundering.
Money laundering.
Yeah, they had to pay like $3 billion of a fine.
Right.
Yeah.
And for me, it was more about the narrative, right? And that's why, again, like, I don't disagree with anything you said. I firmly agree with it. It's more, I think we're entering a period. This is optimistic on the U.S. side, but I think we are entering a period of a bifurcation between, I've kind of been calling it the city on the hill template, where what drew people to the American experiment a couple hundred years ago, it wasn't just the idea. It's like, ideas are great, right? Okay, yeah, freedom, rah, rah, let's get away from England. It's going to be great over there. What really drew the flood of immigrants to the United States was when the experiment was working, right? Like when the U.S. had this unprecedented period of growth and unchecked growth. I mean, quality of life, ownership, individual ownership. You mentioned rights coming from the individual, all that kind of stuff, right? And I think maybe what we're heading into in 2025 is an accelerated version, a bifurcation, where if Canada goes down this path of acceleration, I suppose, with Carney, and maybe it's deceleration. They're pivoting hard away from sovereignty, further linking themselves to EU bureaucrats, to central bankers. They're installing central bankers as their leaders. If that's happening in an environment in which the United States is entering this new, smaller government, anti-central banking, or at least less central banking than there was, lower taxation environment, and if that starts to work in the United States, you have to think that Canadians are going to start looking at their already $1.6 million ranch houses going up to $2.3 million, and looking at the U.S. going in the opposite direction and wondering what the hell's going on up there.
Yeah, I hope so. That's been the trend of all of my studies of Canadian history have been based on that dynamic of the empire obsessively trying to figure out how to keep Canadians blind to the reality of U.S. freedoms being good for the people on an economic and cultural level. That's been like that's the theme. That's the multipolar that unites all of the history. So I'm just seeing this as another chapter of the same thing I've seen repeated again and again and again. I'm hoping that this one is we're able to take those disastrous examples of us screwing up and not making the right decisions and making the right decision this time. I do sincerely hope so. But I'm looking at the Carney angle. Carney's a vicious technocrat, like really, really vicious. I would be frankly happier with blackface in play.
He's funny.
He's funnier, more easy. Yeah, much more easy to just mock as just a failed personality who's just incompetent and incapable of doing anything outside of his handler's controls. Whereas Carney is super competent, super like really high-end, first-tier, vicious technocratic manager with
a professional, high-class globalist criminal is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. So he makes me more nervous in many ways, and the mental hypnotic induction that's been done on the Canadian zeitgeist is so wickedly intense it's so hard for Canadians to look at any of the things that you and I just talked about. It's really unimaginably, for an American, it's a lot more easy to acknowledge a lot of these types of uncomfortable truths because you have it sort of baked into your DNA that we are the people that rejected hereditary institutions. Like it's sort of passed down almost subconsciously as a truth that's true. Whereas in Canada, those cultural forces are simply not there. So I do hope so. The other thing, though, that I would say is a danger is that he is very closely enmeshed with a think tank that was brought in to set the stage for Barack Obama and the behaviorists that came in with him, Larry Summers, and there's a whole slew of these economic behaviorists that came in 2008 with Obama. A big chunk of what groomed that operation in North America was this Canadian think tank, which is still there, very powerful, called Canada 2020. And it was set up in 2005 by a group of privy councillors, and several of those leading privy councillors, I wrote it's a chapter in one of my books. Several of them are co-architects of the North American Union, which got put on the back burner back in 2007 when it was seen as like not expedient. And I think that there's a fight between like a continental integration strategy with, I think, a much more authentic expression of that, the Lincoln McKinley spirit representing a real continentalism on the one hand, but I think the empire has been trying to fight for influence over what that will be. And the group that Carney works with in Canada 2020, his wife is the research director for Canada 2020. This is the group that selected and installed Justin Trudeau. They brought in Larry Summers, Barack Obama. They bring in Hillary Clinton into Canada.
Right.
And they're largely behind the North American Union, the first draft of it back in 2005, which is what they would like. There's that version of it, which would trick America into becoming over time more Canadian than Canada becoming more American. So there's that battle line as well that they want, I think, use Carney also to sort of try to put into motion certain dynamics, which I think Canadians and Americans should be aware of in order to fight back and thwart.
Right.
And the other thing too is I think that they're trying to seduce China. So I think one of the things we just announced a few weeks back, these people running Justin and Mark Carney announced that Canada is going to build its first high-speed rail line between Quebec City to Toronto. And I'm okay with that. I've actually been fighting for that sort of thing for a long time. I think it's a good idea. And they want to use the Canadian Infrastructure Development Bank to fund it, which I'm okay with as an idea, as a mechanism. But the intention behind it isn't so much that they want to develop Canada. It's that they want to bribe Canadians, as they've done in the past, by giving us some free stuff to make our comfort level increase so that we won't feel all that revolutionary about some of the things going on in the US. And also, I think they're trying to send some signals out to try to confuse or seduce China into saying, hey, look, your relationship with Russia might get more precarious if the US becomes friends with Russia. There's a lot of like bad anti-China messaging. They're confiscating Chinese farmland in the US. There's a lot of, you can't trust Russia anymore, but you can trust Canada. We've got a lot of cheap, abundant resources for you, China. And look, we're building high-speed rail just like you are. And I think that a danger that I see as one scenario is to try to weaken the bonds of Russia and China, utilizing Canada and I think China's too smart for that. They've been burned enough by the British Empire to fall for it. But it's something that they're gaming right now as another aspect of it to keep in mind.
Totally. And man, we have to do another episode soon on all of the Russia, because the main stuff I wanted to talk to you about is that the Russia and China and everything. But I know Matt's got a lot going on this week. The interesting thing you mentioned, we've got a few minutes left here. It's interesting when you talk about the comfort level of Canadians, because to your point about sort of the inherent foundational American rights, it blew my mind. It blows my mind how few Canadians that I talk to in my day-to-day interactions of family members, etc. These are normie Canadians, not Badlands Canadians, that they think it's silly how often Americans talk about freedom and rights and individual, and it's like, okay, taking away the cartoonish response to that, where we're almost we viscerally react to that kind of thing as Americans, even liberal Americans. Now, I'm not communists, not the new age liberals, but I'm a classical liberal American, Northeast Democrat, JFK, dad's a union plasterer, mom's a union teacher, all that kind of stuff, right? Like the JFK liberal. Those people are fiercely patriotic in their own way, that generation. But your point about comfort, I think, is the key. I think Canada is a great demonstration, in a bad way, that if you just make the people comfortable enough, the old boiling the frog analogy, Canadians truly don't think that the Americans going on and on about their rights matters, right? Because on a day-to-day lived experience kind of comparison point, they traditionally haven't felt like their lives are that much different from Americans. So I think they're sitting there going like, well, yeah, you guys go on and on about all your little American freedoms, and we're doing just as well here. Now, in my anecdotal experience with Canadian family members, I do actually think that that's changing. And I wonder what you think about this. Maybe we can kind of end on this. As an example, my brother-in-law, a few years younger than me up in Canada, very successful, works in the financial industry. His wife comes from money, fairly successful, etc. You got two people that I believe make over six figures, each of them, or at least in that neighborhood, right? Like as a household, they're probably at 150K on the low end, 200 or more on the high end. They cannot find a house right now that doesn't require a bunch of work to put into it. And even though the US is not in a fantastic position, when you talk to Americans, especially of kind of my generation, like in their 30s, it's mind-blowing when they'll just be tossing out like, yeah, we're looking at a single-family home, $1.6 million or something like that, as if it's this normal thing. And I wonder, this is all just to say, I wonder if that economic pressure and bifurcation point is going to start to make it very difficult for the powers that be to keep that story going, to keep that illusion going that, hey, there actually isn't much of a difference between your lived experience as a Canadian and the Americans down south. But I wonder what you think of that. I mean, it seems like it's been significantly more difficult for Canadians than it has been for a lot of Americans the last 10 years.
Yeah. No, I've got similar experience as well with friends, even family members who have very good jobs, and in any other time in history, they would be able to qualify for a mortgage, and they can't. So I agree with you. The pressure cooker is going to increase as scarcity increases, as it will with economic disintegration, economic turmoil. There will be supply chain breakdowns. Prices are going to increase, and they don't even have to. It's just when you look at that's a side note, but retaliatory tariffs, the way Canada is doing them, they're targeting mostly food imports that are only going to hurt American farmers and Canadian food eaters, which are already, who are already kind of strained. So they're not really done with an intention of building up Canada. They're being done specifically for punitive reasons. Tariffs are good, but they have to be done with the right intention in mind. Otherwise, they just become disastrous. I guess for me, my concern in a time of revolutionary, these pregnant moments, as I mentioned at the beginning, right? Like there's these moments, these dense moments of potential, and you need to have very qualified leadership in order to direct and to help awaken the natural law sentiments inside of the souls of the people who may not otherwise understand the subtleties of what caused their crisis and how to navigate through the multiple layers of sophisticated misinformation. It's a minefield, right? That's put there in order to get us to make missteps, which we make more missteps when we act in fear, when we have hungry bellies, when we're more angry, we don't think as creatively. And I think that that's part of why there's such a full spectrum blasting of narratives across Canada, which is loud and deafening. And I think that there's a similar thing that Americans are suffering from, to try to convince us all that our true nemesis that we should devote our hate and fear and anger to is China. You got a spinning, sophistry-ridden spinnings of logic that acknowledge real injustices that are actually accountable for the European-based oligarchical bankers that have been doing this for centuries and are still doing the international drug money, organized crime syndicate control management. All of that is controllable by the oligarchs in Europe. But instead, most Canadians, if you gave them a survey, they would say, oh yeah, it's evil Chinese communist, Chi-Com, CPC who hate our freedoms. And it's very similar that I'm feeling these similar sentiments to what we could see in the wake of 9/11, when before 9/11, there was no desire, no will to go to war in the Middle East and bomb countries back to the Stone Age. And after 9/11, there was just like freedom fries and Muslims want to kill our freedoms and similar things now, but China's now the new focus, the new boogeyman that's being given to us. So I think that's an unfortunate thing that I really want to correct. And I hope enough Canadians listening to this and Americans can take on a responsibility to help their fellow patriots understand this misdirection and redirect focus where it matters.
Hey, I'm doing my part, man. I wrote the Righteous Russia series, and I'm not a historian, right? So it just shows that you do not have to be a historian to at least ask questions. And I always try to presage that by saying, I am not an expert in Russian history. I am merely trying to reverse engineer the story of Russia as it has been told to the Western mind, right? And contrast that with the story of the West that we've been told as the Western mind, right? And one of the things I say often on this show is I don't end my analysis with the opposite game, but I start it there very often, right? Because when you find out that X power structure has been lying to you about virtually everything that they've ever told you, then a good starting point is to consider the opposite. And to your point about China too, I started going down that rabbit hole about 2 years ago maybe. And man, isn't it interesting that we've had a Tigers and Flies campaign, an anti-corruption campaign over there. We've had one in Russia dating back to the 90s. Donald Trump kicked it off after those two guys. We're actually probably further behind them in many ways. And next time I have Matt on, I want to go all the way into all of that stuff. So I hope I can have you on pretty soon. I know you are traveling with the family and everything. So I really appreciate you coming on. What are you working on right now? When are you back in the saddle?
We're going to be back in April 8th. We're going to return back to North America. So far we're just
and
bouncing
Mark
around
Carney's
Asia.
goons will be waiting for you when you get off the tarmac.
Yeah. No, I just found out that guy is also a director of Stripe, which is how I get most of my payouts from Substack is through Stripe. That Mark Carney is actually running that, and they've made already a big deal about debanking as a great tool to stop extremism. So yeah, that's making me a bit nervous. Anyway, my wife and I, Cynthia, we're hopping around. We're having meetings. We're doing some presentations, and so we're going to be back there. Right now, we just released a little policy document called Canada's Potential Eurasian Future that people can get on Amazon, or we can send out signed copies. That goes through like we want to get citizens and policymakers to awaken their understanding of these things that we've talked about today and what types of great projects we could build if we have a real American system spirit revival with an outlook towards cooperation with the USA, Russia, China, that all want to have a future, that want to reject the death cult, and that we can do some beautiful things. So this goes through that, and it's like 120 pages, very short, full color. So that's out. We just released that a few weeks ago. People can pick it up. Otherwise, just keep them busy, man. Looking forward to maybe we can make this whole New England GART thing work out, and I can meet some of the people. Who knows?
Make it happen, man. Just get in there. John will get you down here, and we'll hang out, get you on some panels, because it's the perfect GART for you to come to, because first of all, it's pretty close, right? And then second of all, it's like the hotbed of history, right? It's so much of the revolution people talk about in New England. But I think growing up in this, I was born in Plymouth County, and growing up in this area, you take for granted thinking like every American knows all the history of Plymouth County. But you realize as you get older that most Americans know the history of the American Revolution, but there's an entire separate and much earlier history of Plymouth County That might go back to what we talked about at the beginning of this show, of where some of that DNA that was it was already maybe too baked into the American mind that they couldn't quite subvert as easily, right? Because the Plymouth County was literally founded on fierce independence, like long before the Revolution. It was people coming here to be like, yeah, fuck off, right? So, anyway, that'd be a great one for you to come to. Yeah, next time we're talking about Arctic railways, U.S.-Russia, sovereign alliance is a real thing. Matt's going to bring the sauce and the actuals of all of the stuff I just say and make wild claims, and then Matt will support all of those wild claims with historical fact. That's how I'm drawing it up.
I'll do my best. All right.
All right, man. Thanks a lot for joining. Thank you guys for supporting, and I'll see you next time, Matt.
All right. See ya. Bye.
All right, guys. Matt Ehret, jury's still out. Is he a spy? Does he exist? Is he a hologram? We don't know the answer to any of these things, right? Little sus. The first time I have him on, he's not even in Canada. He's in another place, overseas, having meetings, talking about his wife setting up meetings, follow the wives. What's really going on with Matt Ehret? If he doesn't accept the invitation to GART Plymouth, we're going to know that something's going on with him. As you guys know, this show often goes into different rabbit trails. I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion. It made sense that we had to start with and ended with, as it would turn out, Canada, the US, some of the history of Canada. I hope you guys enjoyed that and got a lot out of it. What I want to talk about in the future, Matt does a lot of writing on Russia, on China, and you guys know that obviously I do a ton of commentary on Russia and recently on China, the multipolar world, the sovereign alliance, many different names for it. But the really interesting thing about some of Matt's writing before the Hitler series he was doing is I had no idea that back in the 1800s, I believe pre-Civil War, could be wrong about that, but I believe pre-Civil War, there were plans for the United States and Russia to have joint transcontinental Arctic economic, transportation, energy corridors, like connecting the two countries. And lo and behold, what some would claim to be a globalist subversion, very violent globalist subversion, kind of took all that off track in the late 1800s from the American perspective. And then in the early 1900s, we had the Bolshevik Revolution, the murder of the czars in Russia. And man, the more you look into that stuff and project ahead, one of the reasons I'm so positive is if you guys don't think that the deal is already done, that the macro deal of peace between the United States and Russia, observe that the headlines beneath the headlines recently revolve around Moscow and Kremlin associates and foreign ministers talking about joint economic projects with the United States in the decades ahead. Now, if they didn't know that the deals were already done, they're not going to be talking about joint economic projects with the United States for the first time in almost 200 years, guys. Like, that's not the way this stuff works. The leaders of these nations right now are pretty confident that we're going to be moving into that future. But yeah, learning about some of the history of Canada is pretty fascinating, and we could have gone into a lot more stuff there. 2 hours flew by. Canada is a strange and fascinating place. There was like one Canadian bot in the chat getting upset about this kind of stuff. Grow up. That's the kind of thing where if you criticize the Bush era, you used to get flag-waving Bushies telling you that you were anti-American. Badlanders are not the same thing as those people anymore. And if you're a Canadian and you're a Badlander, then you're a Badlander first. If you're an American Badlander, you're a Badlander first. If you're tying yourself into sort of reactions to what I'm criticizing about communistic Canadian national identity, then that means that you're probably advancing that kind of ideology, right? If you're not that kind of ideologue in Canada, then you shouldn't be taking offense to this kind of stuff, right? So anyway, that's same old. I'm going to get to some rants and some boosts. Somebody said, I'm a Canadian and not a bot. Some would say that there's not too much of a difference there. I do want to remind people, second reminder of the show. The tickets are on sale now. badlandsmedia.tv/events. Come to Plymouth. Come to Plymouth. It's going to be fun. It's going to be not the same thing as Vegas. You know, quiet city, Boston. I'm not sure if we have the same mimetic potential with Ghost that we had in a place like Vegas, but I'm sure he can make it happen. Check it out. The tickets are significantly cheaper than they were in Vegas because it's Vegas, so that's the way it's going to be. Should be really fun. That's going to be very close for Mrs. Bright and I, so we're looking forward to that. And, you know, tag along. The cool thing about the GARP Plymouth, I think, is that it's probably a place like Deadwood that a lot of us in the audience would want to go to, but you're probably not going to plan a whole trip around it. But if you're piggybacking it onto a GARP, it's the perfect time to come. A lot of history in the area, plenty of pubs, can do a pub crawl, and just extend it into a trip. It's probably, depending on traffic and everything, about 45 minutes, an hour max to the city if you want to either start in Boston and then come south, or start south and then go to Boston. But yeah, check it out. We'll see a lot of you guys there. GART New Englanders or Badlands New Englanders better show out. We got a boost. P. Dwyer sent $100 in last week and said, what if Tartaria was real? What if their society was based on free energy? Would their currency be paper, or would their currency be based on energy? Chinese dragon family, Satoshi? These thoughts led me to Bitcoin. Please do a deep dive. That's fascinating that is what led you to Bitcoin. As I often say, there's many paths to the mountaintop. First of all, thank you very much for the support of the show. If you guys watch on replay, you can go to badlandsmedia.tv and click on boosts if you want to send over any support. I have no idea about that, but yeah, I mean, we've talked it to death. People get annoyed about it. Once you kind of see what's going on with Bitcoin, in my personal opinion, it is related. There's a reason G-Money can work it seamlessly into every conversation in the info war, because when you've got literal central bankers openly ruling over the country, the fake country that borders us, you start to maybe look a little bit more closely into the sort of technology that can strip power away from central bankers, or at least protect your sovereign power from it. And hey, maybe we're going to a gold standard. Maybe there's going to be a basket of commodities type of approach. I'm just saying, you know what the central banks back their currencies with is gold. And they took it all. And yeah, we can seize it back, but how long are we going to play that sort of shell game? We'll see what happens. We have a bunch of boosts. Tom Terrific 54, $25 for the cause. Thank you very much, Tom. Sass Sprague 7780, $20 from one to another. Even if I strayed from one, I think they said masshole to another originally, but that got deleted. Love your work and what you do. This is the person who strayed away from Massachusetts. Yeah, trust me, it's tempting sometimes to look at Florida, etc. But New England's a pretty awesome place, and I do sort of have the mentality of, we're just going to run away from each state that they kind of take over? All that's going to let them do is consolidate power in those states and then kind of subvert the bastions of sovereignty in the other states. So I'd much rather just continue being a Bostonian savage and trying to spread that out. Also, the climate in the rest of the country, I hate most of the country. But Ash said this had been answered later on, but said, Matt, since you claim to be from the super real nation of Canada, that's totally different from the British Crown, can you share your thoughts on Europe's role in modern Canadian national identity? And then she said, never mind my question, you answered it extensively. Yeah, that turned into the theme of the show, so which I think was cool. Canada is the British Empire. And I remember my father-in-law at one point saying, like, we have a constitution too, and I wish I had been more equipped a few years ago to tell him how wrong he was about his own Canadian history. I inherently knew that it must be wrong because Canada does not operate as if it has a constitution. But Matt succinctly explained that it does have a constitution. It's just one that the government gave to the people rather than the people gave to the government. So, yeah, I mean, little bit silly up there. Cranop, $17, especially intelligent guest BB in his field, that is. Learn a lot from Matt and Ghost. Yeah, they're breaking history. Great show. One of the funny things at Badlands I often say is that we're also focused on our own research, that unless we are talking to each other on shows, we very rarely get to devote the time to digging into each other's research. The reason I actually had a leg up on a lot of Matt's research is because he writes a lot of articles for the Badlands Substack, and I edit those articles. And subscribe to that, guys. Badlands.substack.com. It's free. Ash and Ghost working on the brief every day now. Clearcat 367, $55. BB and Matt, thank you both so much for this truly phenomenal episode. Really hope that Matt will return for part 2, and part 3. Much gratitude, many blessings. He has to, because I named the episode the second topic that we were going to get to, and we didn't get there. So is that my fault? I mean, it is what it is. We'll get there next time. Sleep state, that's an evergreen topic. Sleep state says Meghan is more African American than Kamala, right? I don't know. That's an interesting theory. We see Meghan Markle and Prince Harry become the new super couple in Canada. He is right. That's being seeded as a narrative. My white pill on it is that everything Matt said about Carney is true, and I think horrible for the globalist narrative, because Trump has put them in a position where they have to go full mask off and just tell people, like, listen, we are collectivist, communistic, central bank dictators. That's what we are. Shut up and take it. Also, we're confiscating your savings. Like that, I often say in Overton's goalpost, when the enemy is forced to retreat along previously held psychological ground or narrative ground, that is not an enemy that is in control. I think that's an enemy that is being baited out by Trump into pulling the mask off, and then we're going to see how long can the Canadian frog be boiled until those people act more like the truckers from a few years ago. And somebody in the chat said maybe the frog will boil long enough that it will turn gay rather than embrace its freedom. I guess we'll see. Valesco 16, BB, if you bring Massachusetts back to its days of glory, I'll always teach my children a man tiger saved the country. Deadass, that's what the kids say, and it means for reals. Deadass, yeah, I've heard that. I'm up with the lingo. I've got a 11-week-old. I'm up with all the lingo of the latest shenanigans and chicanery. I'm gonna bring Massachusetts back. I've decided. So, I don't know how I'm gonna do it, but I'm going to do it. Cam Cooksey, first political donation for Matt Ehret, the future first governor of the 51st state of Canada. I will support you in that endeavor. I mean, Matt is still on probation for me. Never met him in person. He ranks above Alpha for me in the Badlands Fed rankings. But has Matt ever had to recite an oath to the British Crown? There's still, there's still some stuff to figure out when it comes to Matt. We're all going to be able to get a better feel for him if and when he comes to Plymouth. So we'll suss him up. We'll size him up then. Velasco 16, I'll up the chat $5 just to say I usually don't watch chat, but damn, BB, you're getting hit. I usually just watch and comment. Does this happen to all of Badlands? I'm talking about the bots. I didn't think it was really botted tonight. There was a couple fake Canadians or real Canadians, which are not real people anyway, talking about how upset they were about being Canadian. And that's fine. That happens to Canadians. When you provoke them, they start to get very insecure. It's an insecurity is the national identity up there. So, as Matt said, and he is one of them, when your national identity is not being American, liking Maple Leafs and hockey, there's not a lot there. So, we gotta bring that back. In terms of bots in chat, though, yeah, contrary to what some of you believe, there absolutely are coordinated campaigns, and but we're wise to all that stuff. We kind of know what's going on there. Velasco again said, hey, if you're OG Badlands and want to comment, at least drop $1. Show these boy fags they can't win. Bot fags, not boy fags. Thank you very much, Velasco. And Melindy said, BB, you might find this take interesting. For my favorite actual Irishmen are the Slavs holding off the caliphate. Sounds like a Ghost question. Thank you. The Winged Hussars. Yeah, Ghost has written a lot about the Winged Hussars, and Matt as well. Fascinating bit of history with the Riders of Rohan in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings are actually based on. You thought I wouldn't go there. You thought I wouldn't be able to work in Tolkien references toward the tail end of the show, but I was able to. And I think that's going to do it for us. Somewhat short episode of the narrative. Matt was traveling. He was like 11 hours ahead. So he was sitting down with his morning coffee there, has a whole day ahead of him. And as you can see, my voice is starting to go. This will probably be a good thing that I'm not going 3.5 hours tonight. We'll be back on Tuesday night for Badlands Story Hour with Chris Paul. Wednesday night with the Power Hour with John Harold. On Tuesday night, the movie is Inglourious Bastards, which is a retelling of the fake history of World War II in equally fake formatting, but extremely entertaining and arguably the best dialogue in any movie ever. So that should be a really fun one to explore. And if you guys are interested, please like the show. It helps us get on the leaderboard. I got a lot of really great and encouraging in-person feedback about the show. You know, it's not everybody's cup of tea talking about narratives, etc., but very thankful for the people that it is. And if you guys are interested in supporting or looking at anything else I'm doing around these parts, check out burningbright.substack.com. I released an article today, The Cards. This is all about Donald Trump's power projection capabilities. We've got of Rivals and Reckonings. I can do this all day. A lot of recent briefs talking about a lot of the stuff Matt and I talked about tonight. Sort of power projection, a lot of the method behind the madness of what Trump's doing. And, you know, it's all free. And the other thing that is free, which is where you're going to find a lot of Matt's work, is on badlands.substack.com. We've got some Joe Lang going on recently. When's the last thing from Matt? We've got, I don't know where his last one was. Reagan, Matt Ehret. Here we go. Real Patriots Don't Think Like Hitler. He's got that one in there. There's some fascinating stuff that he's written in the Substack. Give you a different perspective on it. As always, Ghost and Ash are writing the news brief these days. I'm contributing to it when I can, but baby bright. Taking a lot of time. He'll probably be waking up in just a few minutes. So thank you very much, guys. Hit the thumbs up button. Share the episode with friends. And we will see you next Sunday night, 9 p.m. Eastern. And I better see every one of you in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And I'm going to know if you're not there. So just let's not have to have that conversation in a few months. All right, guys. The war is a story. The story is a war. Act accordingly. Outroing with the intro. Thank you very much, and good night.
We were sleeping. I've been sleeping. I've been turning away from a truth I wanted not to face. There is a wound that won't heal at the center of the galaxy. There is a darkness reaching like rust into everything around us. We let it grow, and now it's here.
How many men have you killed, Merlin?
I don't know.
50? 100? Countless.
Countless has a nice ring to it.
And how many lives have you saved?
500,000. Population of King's Landing. Tell me if your precious Renly commanded you to kill your own father and stand by while thousands of men, women, children burned alive, would you have done it? Would you have kept your oath then?
Our time has come. Be prepared. we grew stronger. While you rested in your cradle of power, you were trusted to lead the Republic. But you were deceived. You assumed no force could challenge you. And now, finally, we have returned.
The visions are clear now. I see possible futures all at once. Our enemies are all around us. And in so many futures they prevail. But I do see a way. There is a narrow way through.
It's not a prophecy. It's a story that you keep telling, but it's not their story, it's yours. They deserve to be led by one of their own. What your people did to this world is heartbreaking.
We gave them something to hope for.
That's not hope! We have survived by hiding from them, by running from them. But they are the gatekeepers. They are guarding all the doors, they are holding all the keys, which means that sooner or later, someone is going to have to fight them.
I wish none of this had happened. So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
Forgive me. I did not see. I have failed you all. You forgave me. Captain Armor, I do not know what strength is in my blood. But I swear to you, I will not let the White City fall. Our people fail. Our people. Our people.
I wish you good fortune in the wars to come. And now it begins.
No. Now it ends.